Feel free at any time to ask questions. I definitely don't want to be the only person talking. So when we talk about feminism, we have to first talk about gender. When we're talking about gender, there is the concept of what we would call the gender umbrella. So there are various aspects that make up what we would call gender or our gender identity. And there's a lot of things that play into that. So when someone says, what is a woman? Some people would first go to biological sex. Biological sex would then be determined by what?
What biologically makes you a woman?
What does that mean?
You know, like the things.
Like anatomy?
Yes, anatomy.
So anatomy can be something that would constitute being a woman. What if I told you that more than 1% of births in the United States were babies with ambiguous genitalia? How then would you determine biological sex?
Preference?
Preference?
Yeah.
So when the baby comes out of the room, they're like, I'm female, I'm male.
I think it's scientifically called intersex when it's ambiguous, right?
Sometimes. So the bottom line to this is, while these are certainly identity markers, there are always gray areas, and there are always critiques that arise from creating static notions of identity. And I think that's particularly seen in something like biological sex. So what does it mean to be male? What does it mean to be female? When we're referring to biological sex, we're almost always referring to male or female as those identity names. Then you have gender or gender role. Your gender role is what is prescribed to you by society. So it's what society says is a man or what society says is a woman. So if you perform or look a certain way, society will then say you are a man or you are a woman. Gender identity is what you identify as. So I identify as a woman and perform as such. And sometimes that coincides with what our gender or our gender role is and what our biological sex is, but does not always coincide with those things. And then the last thing under this gender umbrella is sexuality. So sexuality is what? I promise this is boring if it's only me talking.
Sexuality being like certain preferences to like a partner or like.
Yeah, it's who you like. Oftentimes sexuality is talked in the context of gender. It can also be talked about separately. We'll see that when we talk about the second wave of women's movement. So when we talk about lesbian feminism, it's also at the very, very beginning of queer theory. Queer theory came from gender studies. So that's often why we see a discussion of that. The other reason why we often see a discussion about sexuality in the context of the gender umbrella in women's studies is oftentimes when we have critiques of what it is, of static notions of what, you know, gender identities are. Those are often encompassed with critiques of static notions of sexuality. What does it mean to be masculine?
I know toxic masculinity. I saw an article about like man box, which is like certain things that toxic masculinity is made of, like aggressiveness or like heterosexuality, things like that. But I don't think all masculinity is bad. I think like toxic masculinity is more easy to like label.
That's fair. What are some typical characteristics of femininity that we would think of, that society tells us?
Like longer hair, you could wear like dresses and stuff. I don't know, you probably don't like, well, yeah, I don't really know. I mean, things are kind of changing, so it's not like super traditional anymore. Everyone's wearing everything, and like girls cut their hair, guys grow out long hair, but still like, yeah. Or like earrings, necklaces, like jewelry. That's like a feminine thing.
I also think like being weaker is a common I think being weaker is a common like stereotype that's put on women.
I think that's absolutely true. Displays of strength are often associated with masculinity, so then the contrast of that would be weakness, which then would be associated with femininity. These characteristics are often things that are told to us by society, that feminism and other things like that have been critiqued in terms of what they have felt is true or not true and things like that. And we'll go ahead and get into that. So next thing, what is your definition of feminism? What words come to mind when you hear feminism? You're taking a lecture on feminism and movements. Sonia, go for it.
Like equal rights. Females should be on an equal level as males in society.
Females or women?
Women.
Okay. So women should be on equal level as men in society. What else? Anastasia, you were going to say something?
Yeah. Since we, like, right now, I think most feminists believe in, like, intersectional feminism, which, like, protects everybody. So I think a lot of, like sexual assault issues, like, it's, like, helping everybody, you know? It's, like, everybody's going to try and be equal.
Yeah. I think there are certain aspects of feminism that are collaborative in nature that I think certainly plays into that. Someone else is going to say something?
Oh, I was just going to say power.
What do you mean by that?
I think a big part of feminism, and this kind of is like similar to what Sonia was saying, but is to dismantle like existing power structures that have been around, and like not only dismantle those power structures, but really enhance the power that women have and that they should have, whether that's like over their bodies or over their like equal pay or whatever that is. I think that like taking power back also.
I love that. Yeah. So I've included some definitions of feminism, and they're different. And feminism means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And there is a really fascinating book called The F Word from Lisa Foster, I want to say. And she talks about a more recent phenomena of people being hesitant to identify as a feminist, or, yeah, I'm a feminist, but type thing. And I think a lot of that has to do with this notion of activity. And I think it's actually, I think that was more of like a 90s, 2000s problem before social media became a form of activism, but we'll talk about that in a second. So definitions of feminism, I clearly can't spell. Feminism is the struggle to end sexist oppression. Its aim is not to benefit solely any specific group of women, any particular race or class of women. It does not privilege women over men. That's hook. What is a key component of that definition?
That it doesn't privilege women over men.
Yeah, so I think this often comes when, you know, women's studies whereas men's studies, or I believe in equality. That's why I'm not a feminist. I don't believe that women should be more powerful and things like that. And I think those are certainly myths propped up by power structures that social equality is a finite resource, that, you know, it's one pie that people are taking out of, as opposed to a renewable resource that's built upon each other. Rebecca West says, people call me a feminist whenever I express sentiments that differentiate from a doormat or a prostitute. Why do you think I included that definition?
I think it's because, like, gender roles, I think a lot of men, or like not even men, but like society believes that women are kind of like, you know, like they think that their primary use is like their bodies, or like to serve like men. I mean, that's just the gender roles. I don't believe in that, but I think that's the definition. Like, people used to believe that's what feminism was. And old feminism, like the first definition, old feminism is only like white women. We don't do that anymore. Like, I think the third line of the quote is like, we have like colored women, we have like LGBTQ plus women and trans women and like women of all classes. It's just like intersectional feminism now.
Yeah. The last one, the advocacy of women's rights on the grounds of political, social, and economic equality to men. This is probably one of the most common definitions. I think the critique of this definition is it is characterizing women's rights in the context of men's rights, right? So to men, but I think that's a pretty basic definition. Yeah, we'll move on. Cool. So we're going to talk about the different waves of women's movements. I think the caveat to this is, so this is a lot of historical references. This lecture primarily is a primer on historical notions of feminism in the context of a lot of white feminism. And then the second lecture I'm giving, I think it's like next week, is more so critiques of feminism in the context of other feminists. So that lecture will talk a lot about intersectionality, Black feminism. We'll talk about developing countries, indigenous feminism, hooks, all of that stuff. So I wanted to separate it because I often feel like that sect of literature gets a back burner to a lot of the history and suffrage discussions. So I wanted it to have its own like lecture. So today we're just talking about history, all of the white feminism, but it's not the only thing that will eventually be discussed. So there are different waves of women's movements. The first wave is very distinct. It started in 1840 and ended in 1920. What happened in 1920 that caused the end of the movement? Women got the right to vote. It's okay. I find it fascinating that we don't learn a lot about this in history. So the first wave was very distinct. It began with the convention with Lucretia Coffin Mott. She was a representative to the World Anti-Slavery Convention. She then came back from that convention and began to draw a lot of correlations between discussions at that convention and women's rights and women's liberation. 1848 was the Seneca Falls Convention. That's where we have people like Lucretia Coffin Mott. We have Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote The Vindication on the Rights of Women, Susan B. Anthony, all at that convention beginning to have these discussions of suffrage, discussions of access to the right to vote. Notable thing is, again, the women suffragists at that time were all primarily upper class, white women, who actually most of them were married. And they had the freedom to read, write, to attend these conventions because they had people working in their homes. They had maids, slaves, etc., working in their homes, which then gave them the freedom to go do these things. At the beginning, particularly with things like the Anti-Slavery Convention, women were working in collaboration with abolitionists and a lot of anti-slavery groups. In 1870, when the 15th Amendment was ratified, declaring the right to vote for Black men, there was a diversion or divesting in the movement. People that had originally campaigned for the 15th Amendment to pass were then, it was theorized that then those people stopped having movements or stopped campaigning because their goals had been met. In 1918, hunger strikes began, still for the right to vote. This is still 40 years after the 15th Amendment was ratified. Again, notable, right? If you're going on hunger strikes, that means you were probably well fed to begin with. People like Alice Tull and Lucy Burns were the ones at the forefront of this nonviolent protest. There's an amazing movie called Iron Jawed Angel that talks specifically about this protest movement. Angel, have you watched it? You were nodding your head. Yeah. Really, really great movie. Kind of some horrific scenery in terms of them being like physically force fed. They were imprisoned and physically force fed when they were on these hunger strikes. But again, it was a method of nonviolent protest for the ultimate goal of women's suffrage. In 1920, on August 18th, women gained the right to vote, and that most theorists say is a clear end to the first wave of women's movements, or the first wave of feminism. That clear beginning with the Anti-Slavery Convention and that clean end, there was one universal goal of the whole movement, which was women's suffrage. This is the cleanest it gets in terms of women's movements with beginning and end, because from here on out, there are certainly beginnings and clear beginnings, but then it becomes questionable as to what it is. There are many different types of feminism, and we'll see that as we move on to the second wave. There are some core beliefs that everyone would believe, but in action, what that looks like is very different. So what happened? So women's suffrage ended in 1920. What was also happening after 1920? What were big events in the world that were happening at that time?
The Depression was about to like jump in.
Yes, and then what happened after the Great Depression?
World War II.
Yes. So we see this a lot in history, just in general, right? When we have areas of great prosperity, that is when a lot of movements are taking place. When we have things like the Great Depression, the instances of social movements sometimes become less prevalent, depending upon what's happening. People are literally starving. We don't have Lucretia Coffin Mott, who has the privileges of traveling to London to go to this anti-slavery convention. So World War II begins. All eligible men go overseas to the war. What are women doing on the home front during that time?
Didn't they have to, well, one, fill in a lot of the jobs that were previously held by men, and also like they were responsible for doing kind of the behind the scenes for the war effort also?
Yeah, so, it's the Rosie the Riveter, we can do it. They're going to factories, they're leaving their homes for one of the very first times and going into the workforce because it's their patriotic duty. Then the war ends, all of those men come back, and what are women expected to do at that point?
Were they expected to just go back and be housemates again?
Yeah, so it's this really fascinating part in history where women, go ahead by leaps and bounds in terms of rights and equality by being forced out of the home into the factories and things like that. But all of that gets curtailed then when the war effort is over. And so all of these women that experience, huge amounts of freedom, we started seeing pants even, which is like a thing at that time, are all then forced back into the home because those jobs were earmarked for men. So then we have, particularly in the 1950s, what we would call, your typical housewife. So has anyone seen like the old TV shows like Leave It to Beaver or the Jeffersons or things like that?
Yeah, I love Lucy.
So, yes, exactly. So we see these characteristics of a woman, being in heels, pearls, vacuuming. And so this concept then that what makes, a perfect woman is in the United States particularly is that of a housewife who, looks perfectly done up while doing the dishes, cooking dinner, while the husband leaves the home to go work, and the woman then stays in the home to do other various things. So I think that particularly is notable of the 1950s period. Then we have the 1960s. This is when we start to begin to see waves of feminism. It started in the 50s as well, but we'll say second wave starts around 1960. What else is happening during this time? What else do we know of the 60s?
The Cold War? I don't really know how that would
Okay. What else do we think of when we think of the 60s?
Don't we start seeing more like movements for Black people? We start seeing
Civil rights movements. We see anti-Vietnam protests. We see, this notion of the hippie, right? Woodstock, etc., is starting to happen in the 60s. And so we see, along with these other anti-war protests, etc., is women's movements and women's protests are also beginning to be on the rise. They all campaigned for various aspects of equality, but they have a diverse set of goals and ideologies. So first, we have Betty Friedan. She wrote Feminine Mystique in 1963. Very easy read, but very cool book in general. She calls what we were just talking about in terms of 1950s housewives as this notion of the cult of domesticity. And this is one of the very first critiques of the public versus private dichotomy. So the notion that women were supposed to be in the home, in the private sphere, and that was their realm. And then that men were to go out into the world to, bring home the bread type concept. She critiqued that. She also critiqued the myths of college education. So women were going to college to get what's called an MRS degree. Have we heard of this before? It kind of makes me happy when people haven't heard of it. MRS degree, or like Mrs. degree, right? So the idea that they're going to college just to get a husband. We saw this as, in colleges at this time, there were literally like home ec degrees that you would, go to college and get. And so the concept that you are seeking an education, not for liberatory functions, not for betterment of yourself, but to find a spouse. We still have this even today. When I was at Texas Tech, they called it ring by spring, which that concept that you would be engaged by that spring year of your last year of college. NOW was also organized in 1966. 30 women from different backgrounds were on this committee. Betty Friedan was one of them. She helped with the founding statements of NOW. It was proposed as a true equality for all women. They demanded that they remove all economic barriers and allow women to, do these various things. NOW is still around today, National Organization of Women, and they are still doing some of these various campaigns. NOW still existing today and still being super active in terms of advocacy is an argument that some people would make as to why we're still in the second wave of feminism. There are some that would believe that we've never left this second wave of feminism because equality has not been achieved, like that goal in general. So after the cult of domesticity, and we have Betty Friedan starting to write, and we have some of these various other movements that are beginning to take place. So this is kind of like one of those primers or hot takes. We'll talk about each of these. A lot of these we also see in debate rounds or concepts of them. And so this is, again, just a brief overview. When we're done with this list, if there's others you want to talk about, we will totally talk about it. So first we have ecofeminism. ecofeminism is probably not a very popular women's movement, but a very popular debate argument, which is why I included it in this. So ecofeminism is a movement that sees connections between the exploitation and degradation of the natural world and oppression of women. It began in the 1970s alongside second wave of feminism and green movements. Again, why I think you could just learn history through women's movements. Notable protests of this time were things like in '78 in New York. Gibbs led her community to protest after discovering that their entire neighborhood was on top of a toxic dump site. So this notion that women were being particularly harmed, they were seeing birth defects and babies that were born, women were being exposed to these toxins because they were the ones staying at home, and led to the evacuation relocation of nearly 800 families from this area. Another notable movement from ecofeminism was in 1980 and 81. Women organized peaceful protests outside of the Pentagon. Women stood hand in hand demanding equal rights, and this movement was known as the Women's Pentagon Action, and was a critique about the exploitation of the community, people, and the environment, which is why it was an ecofeminist movement. People that you will hear or notable authors for ecofeminism are people like Starhawk, which is a funny name, but a popular ecofeminist. And in debate rounds, ecofeminism kind of gets deployed in two ways. So one, and probably the more persuasive way, which is that the exploitation and degradation of the natural world is synonymous with the exploitation and degradation of women. The other way you will sometimes hear it is that, you know, Mother Earth is what we're then oppressing, and that's the problem. Obviously, one sounds a little more persuasive than the other, but is something you often hear about. Does anyone have questions about ecofeminism?
Could you just repeat the date that this started? Or
Mid-70s was when ecofeminism started. The Love Canal protest in New York was in '78, and then the Pentagon protest was in the '80s. So the next one we're going to talk about is power feminism. Power feminism was a term coined by Naomi Wolf in the 90s. Naomi Wolf wrote The Beauty Myth, as well as Promiscuities are two of her big books. And Naomi Wolf contrasts notions of victim feminism with power feminism. In her view, victim feminist presents women as fragile, thus preventing women from taking responsibility for the power they actually have. This is a direct critique of notions of victim. Wolf writes that it projects violence and competitiveness onto men or their patriarchy while disregarding these qualities in women. It's almost a bootstrap-esque argument, right? So women are powerful, and women are powerful as much as they want to be or believe they are. When we create characteristics that are problematic, or when we create situations and say women are being oppressed, that's what speaks power to these notions of oppression. Somers is another one that talks about power feminism. She refers to this more as a traditional feminism in terms of equity, but makes similar points of emphasis on agency in terms of equity and power. What might be problems with this form of feminism?
Isn't it like trying to disprove that, like, when we say that women are being oppressed, that is bad, and that they aren't really being oppressed, they just aren't taking power?
Yeah, it's this very odd, almost victim blaming-esque approach it's often, I think, sometimes dangerous because I think people that may not be inclined to be like feminism is a thing hear about power feminism and they're like, yeah, it's not my fault, you know, it's not patriarchy's fault, it's yours. And so this concept that women need to be the ones empowering themselves, you know, initially sounds like a good thing, but then when we talk about it in the context of like sexual assault, it can certainly be something that's fairly problematic in construction. I think it's a really good example of the fact that there's so many different kinds of feminism, and also that there are certainly not all feminism is created equal in these concepts. So the next we have is liberal feminism. We'll hear this phrase a whole heck of a lot. Liberal feminism is almost all encompassing. So liberal feminism is something that came out of the anti-war protests, particularly with the Vietnam War. And it seems to think that we can reform within systems. So it focuses a lot on collaboration and movements. Susan Wendell says that liberal feminism is the clearest political commitment, including equality of opportunity, and are important to women's liberation, and not necessarily incompatible with the goal of socialist and radical feminism. So the liberal feminism, key components are it can work within the system. It's not in contrast to things like radical feminism, but certainly takes a more, if you want to say a debate word, soft left approach to movements and reform. We'll hear a lot about liberal feminism, particularly in the context of like the abolition K, right? The abolition gender K, in terms of being like reform is good. So liberal feminism is also would say things like now is a good thing. The National Organization of Women would be a very good example of liberal feminism. Then we have radical feminism. Radical feminism is, you know, coining the term personal is political, believes that there needs to be a radical reordering of society, that our current framing of society is one that is incompatible with women's equality. They also were known for consciousness raising groups. So women believed that ways of activism were knitting circles or consciousness raising groups, where that women would gather with one another and discuss problems, discuss ways to combat those issues, and focus on senses of community to do so. Have we all heard of like knitting circles before? Yeah, super cool. So that's kind of radical feminism. We'll hear radical feminism in debate, particularly in the context of alternatives, when we're talking about a reordering of society. Then we have lesbian feminism. Lesbian feminism is really interesting. It was a cultural movement that was most influential in the 70s and 80s, particularly in the United States and Western Europe. And encouraged women to focus their efforts, attentions, relationships, and activities towards fellow women. They believed that women should live separate from men in communes, and that men were inherently patriarchal, and that women should divest themselves from that. Jeffries is one of the key lesbian feminist authors, and she said that there were 7 key characteristics to liberal feminism. There's an emphasis on women's love for one another, separatist organization, so separate from men's organizations, emphasis on community, ideas that lesbianism is about resistance, that the personal is also political, and a rejection of social hierarchy. Oh, and a critique of male supremacy. That's the 7th. I think lesbian feminism is particularly fascinating, one, because I think it's a really good example of how intentions can be the same, right? If we were to look at the goal or intention of like lesbian feminism versus like liberal feminism, that goal is the same. It's this notion of equality, but the way we get to that goal is vastly different. Whereas lesbian feminism is saying that, you know, society is beyond hope, that men are inherently violent, that we must separate ourselves from them. While there can be obvious problems with lesbian feminism, and I think that when feminism is demonized, it often takes kind of the worst pieces of all of these different movements and is like, this is what feminism is, how dare you? When in actuality, it's so much more nuanced than that, and so much more really interlaced in terms of what they are. Last one we're going to talk about is feminist international relations. So this is not a movement. This is really just a debate argument, but one that we hear quite often. FemIR is a critique of the international system and the international order, this notion that we focus on state-to-state action, that we focus on war as a conflict between two states, and not, you know, instances of structural violence, etc., is problematic. Feminist international relations started in like the early-ish 90s. J.N. Tickner was one of the first authors for FemIR. She wrote some really good books, very essentializing. FemIR in general is fairly essentialist. What do I mean when I say essentialist? So essentialism is a term coined by Judith Butler in like the mid to late 90s. I want to say Gender Trouble was like 93-ish. And she critiques the conflation of sex and gender, right? That a static notion of what it means to be a woman is equated to what it means to be feminine, which is then equated to biological sex. So what we talked about at the very beginning. And FemIR very much so uses notions of femininity versus masculinity as a critique of the international order and the way we engage in international relations. Other FemIR authors is Jill Steens. She's pretty great. Sandra Whitworth also writes a lot about it. And V. Spike Peterson are the big FemIR authors. Again, all white women. And all fairly privileged in terms of their critiques of FemIR. We'll talk about other types of critiques next lecture. Does anyone have any questions about any of these types of feminism or a feminist concept that I didn't bring up that you wanted to discuss before we moved on? Okay, so then, remember I said the second wave of feminism was 95-ish, right? So like FemIR is very much so a second wave feminist. It's essentializing, it's white feminism, it's very clear in terms of this goal of patriarchy bad, movements and overarching movements are necessary. And so that's why this is where it begins to blur. So 95-ish is also then when we begin to see the third wave of feminism. So third wave of feminism is particularly fascinating and is created in the context of the rise of social media. I don't mean Facebook, I mean like MySpace at this point, right? Or like online blogs. The internet's just becoming a thing. Again, I'm super old, so we're talking like dial-up at that point. And this notion that questions began to be raised, right? So what does it mean to be a feminist? What does activism look like? Do I have to go stand at the corner waving a picket sign for that to be a form of activism? And one of the most notable parts about the beginning of the third wave of feminism is begin to reorient ourselves in the concept of what activism means. So activism isn't necessarily burning your bra outside of a store, which actually never happened, P.S. Or it's not, you know, going on marches and things like that. While those are certainly forms of activism, there's this notion of an individualized activism, but also the really cool part about this is this notion of engaging in everyday resistance. So this is when we see books like The F Word, right? This critiquing the notion of feminism. We see trends of people being like, I'm a feminist, but, and that but is often accompanied with, you know, or is often accompanied with something around this construction that to be an activist, to be a feminist, one must be actively campaigning at all times. And the third wave of feminism really critiqued that notion of what that looks like. Other questions, you know, became, can I wear dresses and be a feminist? Can I wear lipstick and be a feminist? Is that buying into beauty myths? And so this really heavy emphasis on individualism, and notions of feminism can be different based upon our various identities and social locations. And while we can find commonalities within those, and that is where movements are bred, it is not the only thing, and it doesn't have to be the only thing in terms of that. So third wave of feminism is also where we begin to see this critique of white feminists, right? When we think of liberal feminism, when we think of the feminists, almost all of the feminist movements I've brought up until this point, they're all white privileged women, right? Betty Friedan was able to write a book because she probably had people of color working for her in her household. She probably had housekeepers. She probably had nannies. The very fact you were able to go to college, right? These notions of privilege opened up space for these broad sweeping forms of activism. The third wave of feminism began to heavily critique that notion in terms of that as well. It also began to focus on building coalitions. So this is also when we begin to see writings about queer theory. We begin to see Butler's writings. And so this idea that we can be different and we don't all have to believe the exact same thing, but building coalitions amongst each other is particularly good. The question of can men be feminist is also something that gets raised at this time. Tarrant, T-A-R-R-A-N-T, writes an amazing book in 2005 called Men and Feminism. And it's a really great discussion of what it means to be a man and be a feminist and what that might look like. Questions about the third wave of feminism? So again, there is a disconnect in terms of, are we still in a third wave? Did we never leave the second wave? And then there are some people that are like, we are beyond the third wave, we are in a fourth wave of feminism. And so the key component or the key difference of the fourth wave of feminism is fourth wave of feminism is a specific critique on gender. So this is when we begin to look at what it means to conflate the two, to conflate identities, to have static notions of gender. There was often questions of what it was to be a woman in the second wave, but those questions were almost always in the confines of what it meant to be a woman in comparison to a man. So am I a woman if I don't have kids versus fourth wave, which is, am I a woman if I'm performing masculine characteristics, or if I am biologically, you know, society is telling me that I am male, but I am performing as a woman, or I identify as trans. That is all starting to come out of the fourth wave. This is also where we're seeing queer theory, which is a critique of the static notions of gender. And it's also when we begin to hear phrases like gender is performance. So we perform our gender, and that performance can change based upon days, based upon who we're around, and what that might look like. Does that make sense? Simmons writes a really great gender and performance ethnography, where he, as a feminine man writes about different interactions he has with his family at different components of his life. And it's a really great, beautiful writing that looks at gender, that identifies and discusses gender as performance. I would also say, particularly with the third and fourth wave, there is also a focus on, well, maybe the third wave more than the fourth wave, because we have like things like Butler. But in the third wave particularly, I think there's also a focus on accessibility. So I think if you were to pick up Foster's The F Word, the writing is notably different than something like Baudrillard or even like Friedan. The content and the way it's written is very different. And I think it is because there is a focus on accessibility as well as what that might look like. Do we have any questions at this point? We have 9 minutes left, so I can talk about gendered language, or I can talk about some studies about women in debate. Which would you prefer?
Can we talk about women in debate?
Can we get a show of hands? Do other people agree with that?
I mean, I actually want to do women in debate too. I want to hear about your experience as a debate.
Cool. So it's this really interesting, there are several articles and studies that have been done about women in debate. Those studies started in like the early 2000s. There is a lot of interesting data, particularly on college policy debate. There's not a lot of data on high school debate. I think that's more so just because of like IRB and minor reasons than really anything else, right? So Motz and Breshke in the early 2000s started doing research about gender and what women in debate looks like. This study is actually not the Motz and Breshke study. This is a different study. So I'll talk about Motz and Breshke and then we'll talk about this one. So Motz and Breshke did a lot of number and quantitative analysis at the time of what it looked like to be a woman in debate and what those differences were. They were finding that 55% of the college population were women, but in elimination rounds of varsity college tournaments, it was really closer to like 12%. And so they were wondering what that discrepancy was. What was also more interesting was that if you looked at novice debate and JV debate, the differences between men and women in terms of like who was in debate rounds and who was elimination rounds was a lot more equitable. So you were seeing more of that 55% of women to 45% of men in novice and JV. But when you got to the upper components of varsity policy debates, it became a lot more different. Here we go. Motz and Breshke said that females made up 35.9% of participants in varsity debate, but only 26.2% of students advancing to elimination rounds. Scarb took a similar data set and found that women have the same rate of success in lower levels of debate, but those numbers did not translate to open debate. Scarb also identified that all female teams lost to all male teams 53% of the time overall, and the trend was more pronounced in open divisions, especially in the elimination rounds in those open divisions. Motz and Breshke's, this is the site for Motz and Breshke's study if you ever want to go read it. And then this is the site for Scarb's study. It's the same data set because they're all from Cal State Fullerton. So it's just a different writing of the same data. And then a study was actually recently done. This is a survey that was done about high school debate. And it was just some simple yes/no questions. And this was, did you ever experience discrimination or discomfort and 51% said yes, 49% said no. There is discussions of whether or not this data was falsely reported because it was an anonymous survey, and they were questionable in terms of those results. And then overwhelmingly, the amount of people that said that they, had an incident reported that they did not report it to tournament officials. The other study that is particularly interesting is STEP in 2009, focused on sexual harassment, and found that 34% of women in intercollegiate forensics have experienced sexual harassment, and 5% of female competitors experienced unwanted advances by fellow competitors. And that was one of the more recent studies that I've read on sexual harassment in college debate. That's kind of women in debate studies, the TLDR version. What questions do you all have about it? Or the lecture in general, or anything associated with this? Is there something I didn't cover that you have a question about?
So is there like a, I was just thinking like this, so is there like an anti-Blackness gender K discussion where it talks about like the oppression of Black women versus Black men?
So yes, when I do the second lecture, which is the critiques of feminism, we're going to talk a lot about what's called the matrices of domination, which was a term coined by McIntosh, which talks about how our experience in the world is informed by different aspects of our identity. And the way I experience oppression as a white woman is very different than a Black woman would experience. And we'll talk a lot about that. I'm going to talk a lot about that next lecture, but it can also give you readings on it if you want. Hook is another big intersectionality author and a Black feminist. Audre Lorde is absolutely amazing. She coined, master's tools cannot break down the master's house, has an amazing essay about silence and how we're conditioned to be silent. And then Crenshaw, who coined the term intersectionality, will also be discussed. Other questions? Okay, you have like 3 minutes. I'm gonna let y'all get to your next lecture. If you have any questions after this point, feel free to send me an email. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Of course. Bye.